April 12, 1944. Rural Iowa. The morning dew glistened on the endless cornfields as a convoy of army trucks rumbled down a dusty country road, carrying 24 German prisoners of war to their new temporary home at Camp Clarinda. Lieutenant Karl Mueller sat silently, his fingers tracing the fresh bandage covering his wounded shoulder, certain that his capture meant disgrace to his family and the end of his military career. Little did he know that this journey through America's heartland would reveal a truth about his heritage that would forever change how he understood the war he was fighting. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how German POWs in America's Midwest came face to face with their own forgotten heritage, and how that discovery shattered the nationalist mythology they had been raised to believe. The convoy passed through rolling farmland that reminded Mueller of the countryside back in Bavaria. 27-year-old Mueller had been a history teacher before the war, drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1939 despite his private reservations about the Nazi regime. Now he found himself among a group of captured soldiers being transported deep into enemy territory. The Americans had been surprisingly decent captors so far, professional, even courteous at times. It contradicted everything he had been told to expect. "We're almost there, gentlemen," announced Captain James Donovan, the American officer in charge of the prisoner transport. "Camp Clarinda is a work camp. You'll be assigned to agricultural duties on local farms. Follow the rules, do your work, and you'll be treated fairly." Seated next to Mueller was Feldwebel Werner Schmidt, a dedicated Nazi party member who had been with the Afrika Korps until their surrender in Tunisia. "Don't be fooled by their friendliness," Schmidt whispered. "It's all propaganda. Once we reach the camp, the real treatment will begin." "I'm just grateful to be alive," replied Gefreiter Hans Wagner, a young baker's son from Dresden who had been wounded in the same engagement as Mueller. "My brother died at Stalingrad. At least here, we have a chance to survive the war." Camp Clarinda was one of hundreds of POW camps established across the United States during World War II. By 1944, the American heartland held over 425,000 German prisoners, many of them assigned to agricultural work to replace farm laborers who had joined the military. The camps were run according to the Geneva Convention, with adequate food, medical care, and living conditions that often shocked prisoners who expected harsh treatment. As the trucks pulled through the camp gates, Mueller observed simple wooden barracks, a mess hall, and a recreation area with a volleyball court. It looked more like a rustic summer camp than a prison. The new arrivals were processed efficiently, photographed, assigned bunks and work details, and provided with POW uniforms consisting of denim pants and shirts with PW stamped prominently on the back. During their orientation, Camp Commander Colonel Robert Thompson addressed the group through an interpreter. "You are now prisoners of war of the United States of America. You will be treated according to international law. In return, we expect you to follow camp regulations and perform your assigned duties. Many of you will work on local farms. The farmers you'll work for are good people. Treat them with respect, and they'll do the same for you." Schmidt snorted quietly. "American propaganda. They want us to believe we're guests instead of prisoners." The next morning, Mueller and 11 other prisoners boarded a farm truck driven by a middle-aged man named Frank Wilson. As they drove away from the camp, Wilson attempted conversation through the German-speaking guard who accompanied them. "My grandfather came from Germany," Wilson said. "Somewhere near Hamburg, I think. Never talked much about the old country, though." Mueller was surprised by this casual mention of German heritage. In the weeks that followed, he would discover just how common this was. The American Midwest had been heavily settled by German immigrants in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Iowa alone, German Americans made up nearly 25% of the state's population. By the 1940s, many families had been in America for generations, but German surnames and traditions remained prevalent throughout the region. The war had complicated their relationship with their heritage. Many Americanized their names or downplayed their German roots, but the cultural connections remained. Over the next few weeks, Mueller and his fellow prisoners established a routine. They would leave camp each morning, work on various farms during the day, and return to Camp Clarinda in the evening. The work was hard but not unreasonable. and the food was surprisingly plentiful. American farmers often ate alongside their POW workers, sharing meals that included fresh meat, vegetables, and desserts, luxuries that had become increasingly rare in wartime Germany. One warm May morning, Mueller's work detail was assigned to the Schultz farm, about 15 miles from the camp. As the truck turned into the long driveway, Mueller noticed something that made him sit up straight: a mailbox with Schultz painted on its side. "Schultz," he murmured. "That's a German name." "Of course it is," replied the guard, Staff Sergeant Dave Miller. "Half the farmers around here have German names. Schultz, Weber, Hoffman, Schmidt." This whole area was settled by Germans back in the 1800s. As they approached the farmhouse, an elderly woman emerged onto the porch. Mrs. Elsa Schultz, a robust woman in her 70s with silver hair and bright blue eyes, greeted them in heavily accented English, then surprised the prisoners by switching to fluent German. "Guten Morgen," she said. "Welcome to our farm. There's coffee and fresh bread in the kitchen before you start work." Mueller was momentarily speechless. The guard chuckled at his expression. "Mrs. Schultz was born in Bavaria," Miller explained. "Came to America as a child in the 1880s. Her husband's family arrived even earlier." Throughout that day, Mueller worked alongside 3 other prisoners helping to repair a barn roof. During their lunch break, Mrs. Schultz brought out sandwiches, apple pie, and lemonade. She spoke freely about her childhood in Germany and her family's decision to emigrate to America seeking economic opportunity. "My father was a carpenter," she told them. "He heard that in America, a skilled craftsman could own land, something impossible for him in Bavaria. We settled here when I was 10 years old." Mueller found himself deeply affected by her stories. "My mother's family comes from a small village near Nuremberg," he shared cautiously. Mrs. Schultz's face brightened. "Really? My cousin married a man from near there." "What was your mother's family name?" "Becker," Mueller replied. "Becker," Mrs. Schultz exclaimed. "The family that owned the mill? My goodness, we might be distant relatives." The possibility seemed absurd, that he could be related to this elderly American woman, yet Mueller couldn't dismiss it entirely. The world suddenly felt both larger and smaller at the same time. Similar encounters occurred with increasing frequency as the prisoners worked at different farms throughout the region. Werner Schmidt found himself working for a farmer named Schmidt, though they could establish no direct family connection. Hans Wagner discovered the local baker, shared his surname, and had ancestors from the same region of Germany. These discoveries created complex emotions among the prisoners. Some, like Mueller, were fascinated by these connections. Others, particularly the more dedicated Nazi supporters, dismissed them as meaningless coincidences or even viewed the German-American farmers as traitors who had abandoned their homeland. "They left Germany when it needed them most," Schmidt declared one evening in the barracks. "They chose comfort over loyalty. They're no real Germans." "My grandparents left Germany because they were starving," argued Gefreiter Otto Weber, whose family had emigrated from the same region as the Iowa Webers he had met. "They didn't abandon Germany. They were trying to survive. And now their grandsons are fighting against the fatherland," Schmidt countered. "Are they?" Mueller asked quietly. "Or are they fighting against the Nazi Party? Those aren't necessarily the same thing." Such conversations became increasingly common among the prisoners, creating ideological divisions that hadn't been as apparent before their arrival in Iowa. The reality of America, its abundance, its democratic institutions, its accommodation of diverse heritages, contradicted much of what they had been taught about the United States. By mid-June, the prisoners had settled into their new lives. While still confined to the camp when not working, they were granted small freedoms: permission to write letters home, access to books and newspapers, and occasional recreational activities. The camp even organized German-language church services on Sundays, attended by both prisoners and some local German-speaking residents. One Sunday after the service, Mueller was approached by Pastor Reinhardt, who served the local Lutheran congregation. "Lieutenant Mueller, I understand you were a history teacher before the war?" "Yes," Mueller acknowledged. "At a gymnasium in Munich. We have a small historical society in town," Reinhardt explained. "Several members are researching their German family histories. With Commander Thompson's permission, would you be willing to help translate some old German documents?" Mueller agreed enthusiastically. The project gave him intellectual stimulation he had been missing, and it provided a deeper window into the region's German heritage. Working with local amateur historians, he helped translate birth certificates, marriage records, and letters dating back to the 19th century. The documents told stories of hardship in Germany, difficult journeys across the Atlantic, and the challenges of establishing new lives in America. One afternoon, Mueller was working with Martha Hoffman, a retired schoolteacher in her 60s whose grandfather had emigrated from Westphalia in 1867. They were translating a series of letters he had written to family members who remained in Germany. He writes about how difficult the decision was, Mueller translated. He felt guilty for leaving, but he saw no future for his children in Germany. The political situation was unstable, and economic opportunities were limited to those of certain social classes. Martha nodded. That's consistent with our family stories. He always told my father that in America, a person was judged more by their character and work ethic than by their family name or social position. That must have seemed revolutionary at the time, Mueller commented. It still does to some people, Martha replied with a knowing smile. As Mueller continued translating, he came across a passage that struck him profoundly. I will always love Germany, but I cannot support what it is becoming. A nation should exist to serve its people, not demand that its people sacrifice everything for the nation. The words seemed eerily prescient, written decades before the rise of National Socialism, yet capturing exactly what had gone wrong in the Germany Mueller had left behind. Over the following weeks, Mueller's work with the Historical Society brought him into contact with dozens of families of German descent. He helped trace genealogies, identify connections to specific German regions, and translate family documents. In the process, he encountered names from every corner of Germany, names that matched many of his fellow prisoners. One evening in late July, Mueller was having dinner at the Weber farm. The family had taken a particular liking to him, perhaps because he reminded them of their own son who was currently serving in the U.S. Army in Italy. After the meal, Mr. Weber showed Mueller his most prized possession, a detailed family tree tracing the Webers back to 1732 in the Rhine Valley. My great-grandfather left Germany after the failed revolution of 1848, Weber explained. He was what they called a 48er, a democratic revolutionary who opposed the autocratic German princes. When the revolution failed, thousands fled to America rather than face persecution. Mueller studied the document with professional interest. I taught about the 1848 revolutionaries. They wanted to establish a unified, democratic Germany almost a century before Hitler's rise to power. Yes, they were visionaries, Weber agreed. They believed in liberty, equality, and democratic principles. When they couldn't create that Germany in Europe, they tried to live by those principles here in America instead. The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on the parallel histories of Germany and America throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. Mueller found himself reevaluating much of what he had been taught about both nations. Back at Camp Clarinda, these experiences were creating tensions among the prisoners. The camp population had naturally divided into three main groups: committed Nazis who maintained their ideological fervor, apolitical soldiers who had simply been following orders, and those who had always harbored private doubts about the Nazi regime. Mueller increasingly found himself in this third category, though he was careful about expressing such thoughts too openly. Werner Schmidt had noticed the change in Mueller and confronted him one evening. "You're becoming too friendly with these Americans," Schmidt warned. "Don't forget your oath to the Führer." "I'm just doing my work and trying to learn something while I'm here," Mueller responded evenly. "Learning what? American propaganda? These people may have German names, but they chose America over Germany. They're our enemies now. Are they? Or are we simply men caught on opposite sides of a political conflict neither of us created?" Mueller countered. Schmidt's eyes narrowed. "That kind of talk is dangerous, Lieutenant. Some might consider it treasonous." "Questioning is not treason," Feldwebel. "As a history teacher, I was taught that critical thinking is essential. History will judge who was right," Schmidt said ominously before walking away. As summer progressed into autumn, the prisoners were increasingly involved in the harvest. The work was exhausting but satisfying, and the Americans expressed genuine appreciation for their help during this labor shortage. By September 1944, News of Allied advances in Europe reached the camp, creating both hope and anxiety among the prisoners about what the end of the war might mean for them and for Germany. One crisp October morning, Mueller's work detail was assigned to the Hoffman farm several miles north of Camp Clarinda. As the truck turned off the main road, Mueller noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The mailbox at the entrance to the farm read Mueller. "Is that spelled with 2 L's and an E?" he asked the guard anxiously. "Yep, same as your name," the guard confirmed. "Pretty common German name around these parts." As they drove up to the farmhouse, Mueller felt an unexpected surge of emotion. The Mueller farm was a prosperous operation with a large 2-story farmhouse, several barns, and extensive fields of corn and soybeans. The family patriarch, Harold Mueller, was a third-generation Iowa farmer whose grandfather had emigrated from Baden-Württemberg in 1860. During the lunch break, Mueller cautiously approached Harold. "Sir, may I ask where in Germany your family originated from?" Harold considered the question. The town was called Freudenstadt, in the Black Forest region. "My grandfather Johann Mueller left there around 1860. Karl Mueller felt the blood drain from his face. "Freudenstadt is where my father's family is from. My grandfather was named Johann Mueller as well." Harold studied Karl's face with newfound interest. "How old would your Johann have been?" "He was born in 1842, I believe. He would have been about 18 when your grandfather left Germany." Harold disappeared into the house and returned moments later with a faded photograph in an ornate frame. It showed a group of stern-faced men in 19th-century attire standing in front of a black forest hunting lodge. "This is the only picture we have from the old country," Harold explained. "My grandfather Johann is on the far left. The others are his brothers and cousins." The back of the photo lists their names. With trembling hands, Karl turned over the photograph. Written in faded ink were several names, including Johann Mueller and Friedrich Mueller. "Friedrich was my great-grandfather's name," Karl whispered. The two men stared at each other in stunned silence. After a moment, Harold spoke. "I believe we're cousins, Lieutenant Mueller. Third or fourth cousins, perhaps, but family nonetheless." The revelation was overwhelming. Karl had been raised to believe in the superiority of German blood and the importance of German soil. Now he found himself standing on American soil, face to face with a man who shared his blood but had chosen a completely different path. "Does it bother you?" Karl asked hesitantly. "Having German heritage during this war?" Harold considered the question carefully. "I'm an American," he said finally. "Have been for generations. But I'm not ashamed of my German roots. The Germany my grandfather left isn't the same Germany you come from. Countries change, governments rise and fall, but family connections remain." That evening, Karl wrote in his journal, "Today I met a man who might have been me had my ancestors made different choices. He works the same land his grandfather claimed, speaks the language of his adopted country, and his son fights in an army opposed to mine. Yet we share the same name, the same blood, perhaps even the same features. What does this mean for all the grand theories of national destiny we've been taught? Are we enemies because of the choices made by men long dead, or are we family despite those choices?" As word spread through Camp Clarinda about Karl Mueller's discovery, other prisoners began paying closer attention to the names on mailboxes and farm entrances. Over the following weeks, at least 17 prisoners identified potential family connections to local residents, ranging from tenuous links like Mueller's to one astonishing case, where a prisoner named Heinrich Bauer discovered his own first cousin working as a mechanic in town, a man who had emigrated to America in 1936 specifically to escape the Nazi regime. These discoveries had profound psychological effects on many of the prisoners. Some, like Werner Schmidt, doubled down on their ideological convictions, dismissing these connections as meaningless accidents of history. Others found themselves questioning the nationalist mythology that had brought them into this war. Hans Wagner, who had discovered several Wagner families in the area, expressed his confusion during an evening conversation with Mueller. "My entire life, I was taught that blood and soil were sacred, that German identity was something mystical and pure," Wagner said. "But here are people with the same blood who chose different soil, and they seem happy, prosperous, at peace with themselves." Perhaps national identity is more about choice than fate, Mueller suggested. These families chose America, just as others chose to remain in Germany. Neither choice makes them more or less German by blood. Then what were we fighting for? Wagner asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a question Mueller couldn't answer. As winter approached, bringing an end to the agricultural work season, the camp administrators arranged for prisoners with specialized skills to contribute in other ways. Given his background in education, Mueller was permitted to teach history and German literature classes to fellow prisoners. He carefully selected texts that encouraged critical thinking without explicitly challenging Nazi ideology. Works by Goethe, Schiller, and other German humanists that emphasized universal values over nationalist fervor. During one session discussing Schiller's play William Tell, Mueller guided his students through a conversation about resistance to tyranny and the natural rights of individuals. The parallels to their current situation were obvious, though never directly stated. After class, a young soldier approached Mueller. "Sir, my grandfather used to quote Schiller to me," he said. "He didn't believe in the Nazi Party, but he was afraid to speak out. Before I left for the front, he told me to remember that I am a German first and a soldier second, that my first loyalty should be to justice, not to any leader." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Mueller replied. "He is, but I didn't understand what he meant until coming here." By December 1944, news of the Battle of the Bulge created renewed tension in the camp. The German offensive gave hope to prisoners who still believed in ultimate victory, while others privately acknowledged that it was likely a final, desperate gambit. The ideological divisions among the prisoners grew more pronounced. Camp Commander Thompson, concerned about rising tensions, arranged for a Christmas celebration that acknowledged the prisoners' cultural traditions. The mess hall was decorated with evergreen boughs, and the prisoners were permitted to sing traditional German Christmas carols. Local families of German descent donated homemade cookies and cakes prepared according to old country recipes. During the celebration, Pastor Reinhardt addressed the prisoners. "Christmas reminds us that our common humanity transcends national boundaries and political conflicts," he said in German. "Whether we pray in German or English, whether we live in Europe or America, we share the same hopes for peace, for family, for a future without war." For many prisoners, including Mueller, it was a deeply moving experience, celebrating a familiar tradition while surrounded by people who shared their heritage but not their nationality. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the news from Europe grew increasingly grim for Germany. The Allied forces advanced from both east and west, and reports of devastation reached the prisoners through letters and Red Cross communications. Mueller received word that his parents' home in Munich had been destroyed in an air raid, though they had survived. Hans Wagner learned that his entire neighborhood in Dresden had been obliterated in the February firebombing. These personal tragedies affected the prisoners deeply, yet many found themselves conflicted about where to direct their anger. The simplistic narrative of American evil that some had clung to was difficult to maintain when faced with the daily kindness of their captors and the local farming families. The reality was more complex than any propaganda had prepared them for. In April 1945, news of President Roosevelt's death reached the camp. Mueller was surprised by the genuine grief expressed by the Americans, from the guards to the local farmers. He had been taught that Roosevelt was a warmongering puppet of Jewish interests, yet the Americans mourned him as a beloved leader who had guided them through depression and war. Later that month, reports of Hitler's suicide and Germany's imminent surrender created a final ideological crisis among the prisoners. Some refused to believe the news. Others accepted it with quiet resignation. For Mueller and many others, the primary concern was now what would happen to their families and their homeland under Allied occupation. Harold Mueller visited Camp Clarinda in early May, seeking out his newfound relative. "When the war ends, you'll eventually be repatriated," he said. "But if you ever want to return to America afterward, my family would sponsor you. We have plenty of land, and we could use a man with your education." Carl was touched by the offer but uncertain about his future. "Thank you, but Germany will need teachers after the war. I should return home, at least at first." Harold nodded understandingly. "The offer stands, regardless. We're family, after all." On May 8, 1945, The official announcement of Germany's surrender was met with complex emotions at Camp Clarinda. For most prisoners, including Müller, the overwhelming feeling was relief that the killing had stopped, tempered by anxiety about Germany's future and their own eventual return. In the months that followed, as the POW camp system began the process of repatriation, Müller continued his work with the local historical society, documenting the connections between German prisoners and Iowa residents. The project evolved into a more ambitious effort to trace the German immigrant experience in America, recording oral histories and preserving family documents. Before his scheduled repatriation in March 1946, Müller compiled his research into a manuscript titled Two Paths from One Source: The German Experience in America and Europe. He left copies with Harold Müller, Pastor Reinhardt, and the Iowa Historical Society. In his introduction, Müller wrote, "This project began with a simple observation: German names on American mailboxes. It evolved into a profound reconsideration of national identity, historical choices, and human connection. The Germans who came to America and the Germans who remained in Europe share a common heritage, but made different collective choices over generations. Neither path was inherently right or wrong, but the consequences of those choices have shaped world history in ways that continue to unfold." On his final day in Iowa, Müller visited the Müller farm to say goodbye to Harold and his family. After a hearty lunch, Harold walked with Carl to his truck. "Will you write to us when you get settled back in Germany?" Harold asked. "I will," Carl promised. "And perhaps someday I'll return to Iowa, not as a prisoner, but as a visiting cousin." "I hope so," Harold said, extending his hand. "The war is over. Now families can be reunited." As Carl Müller rode back to Camp Clarinda for the last time, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this place. He had arrived as a defeated enemy soldier, certain that his captivity would be the greatest humiliation of his life. He was leaving with a broader understanding of his own heritage and a connection to a branch of his family he never knew existed. In the years to come, Carl would return to teaching in Munich, helping a new generation of Germans understand their complex history. He maintained correspondence with his American relatives and eventually visited Iowa again in 1952 as a free man. By then, Germany was already dividing into East and West, and the Cold War was reshaping global politics. During that visit, standing once again beside the mailbox bearing his own surname, Carl reflected on how differently history might have unfolded had his ancestors made the same choice as Harold's grandfather. One branch of the family had experienced the rise and fall of the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, the Third Reich, and now occupied Germany. The other had built a prosperous life in America, contributing to a democracy that had ultimately helped defeat the very regime Carl had once served. The mailboxes with German names scattered throughout rural Iowa stood as quiet monuments to choices made generations ago, choices that had placed the same families on opposite sides of a global conflict. For Carl Müller and many other German POWs who discovered these connections, these mailboxes became powerful symbols of the arbitrary nature of national identity and the enduring power of human connection that transcends political boundaries. These discoveries challenged everything they had been taught about nationality and heritage. For many, finding their family names on American soil became the most profound and unexpected lesson of their wartime experience. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.